The Zephyrian Bureaucratic Assessment of Sentient Species, Form 7749 Delta, filed under questionable galactic inclusions, contained what might generously be called the most spectacularly wrong evaluation in the history of interstellar relations. Page 43, subsection J, paragraph 12 stated with bureaucratic certainty. Species designation, humans. Classification, Class F fragile entities. Recommended handling. Extreme caution to prevent accidental termination through standard interaction protocols. The genius who authored this masterpiece of misunderstanding had apparently based their entire assessment on humanity's most obvious characteristic, skin that wasn't covered in natural armor plating. To the Zephyrian mind, this was roughly equivalent to discovering a species made entirely of tissue paper and wondering how they'd survived their first rainstorm. The evaluator had noted, with what passed for scientific precision in their culture, that humans possessed disturbingly soft exterior coverings and concerning lack of visible defensive adaptations. What they failed to mention, because apparently nobody bothered asking the right questions, was exactly which planet these supposedly fragile creatures called home. Ambassador Kethvar of the 3rd Territorial Expansion lounged in his command chair, all 7 feet of chitinous magnificence reflecting the artificial lighting of his private office aboard the orbital station. His species had spent millennia perfecting the art of looking intimidating while conducting business, and Kethvar was a master of the craft. His bio-armor gleamed with the kind of luster that said, "I could crush your skull between my thumb and forefinger, but I'm too civilized to do it during business hours." The human diplomatic files lay scattered across his desk like confetti at a particularly boring party. Quinn Reeves, lead trade negotiator for the Terran Colonial Authority. Height, 5 feet, 4 inches. Weight, 132 pounds. Kethvar had seen Zephyrian children with more impressive measurements. The attached holographic projection showed a creature so unassuming that he initially mistook her for someone's administrative assistant. Fascinating. He rumbled to his aide, a younger Zephyrian named Vexthor who possessed all the intellectual curiosity of a particularly dim asteroid. "The humans are sending us someone who looks like she'd blow away in a strong breeze. Either they are making some sort of elaborate joke, or they truly don't understand how real diplomacy works." Vexthor studied the projection with the intense concentration of someone trying to solve advanced mathematics with his feet. "Perhaps it's a test of our patience, Ambassador, to see if we can conduct negotiations without accidentally breaking their representative." "Quite possibly," Kethvar agreed, already composing the amusing anecdote he'd share at the next Territorial Council meeting. "Make sure the environmental controls are set to minimal atmospheric pressure. We wouldn't want to inadvertently compress their fragile delegate into a decorative paperweight." The joke, as jokes tend to do in the universe's grand cosmic comedy show, was about to turn on its head and bite everyone involved in the posterior with the enthusiasm of a caffeinated piranha. 3 days later, the human delegation arrived aboard a vessel that could charitably be described as modest, and less charitably as the kind of ship you'd expect from a species still figuring out which end of a plasma torch got hot. The Zephyrian docking crews watched with barely concealed amusement as the humans emerged from their shuttle, looking for all the world like tourists who'd taken a wrong turn at the galactic equivalent of a truck stop. Quinn Reeves stepped onto the docking platform wearing what appeared to be a standard diplomatic uniform, dark blue jacket, matching trousers, and shoes that suggested she'd prioritized comfort over the kind of intimidating footwear that serious negotiators typically favored. She carried herself with the kind of relaxed confidence that Zephyrians associated with prey animals too stupid to realize they were about to become lunch. "Welcome to Fortress Nexus Prime," Kethvar announced, his voice carrying the sort of gravitas typically reserved for funeral announcements or tax assessments. "I trust your journey was adequate for vessels of your technological limitations." Quinn smiled, and there was something about that smile that should have made every survival instinct in the vicinity start screaming warnings. Instead, the Zephyrians interpreted it as the nervous grin of someone desperately trying to appear brave while surrounded by their obvious superiors. "Thank you for hosting us," she replied, her voice carrying none of the trembling deference they'd expected. "We're looking forward to productive discussions about expanding trade relationships between our peoples." The conference chamber had been designed by someone who clearly believed that subtlety was a character flaw. Massive columns stretched toward a ceiling that disappeared into artistic shadows, while the walls displayed murals depicting various Zephyrian military victories over species that had foolishly opposed their expansion. The message was about as subtle as a brick through a window. We are large, we are powerful, and we have a documented history of turning disagreeable neighbors into historical footnotes. Quinn took a seat at the negotiating table, with the same casual ease she might have shown at a coffee shop, apparently unimpressed by the architectural intimidation tactics. Her human colleagues followed suit, their behavior suggesting they either possessed nerves of steel or were too ignorant to recognize a threat display when it was practically performing interpretive dance in front of them. Before we begin formal negotiations, HFY announced, settling into his chair with a kind of theatrical authority that suggested he'd practiced the movement in front of a mirror, I feel obligated to address certain concerns regarding your species' ability to participate meaningfully in galactic commerce. The human delegation exchanged glances that somehow managed to be both polite and completely unreadable. Quinn leaned forward slightly, her expression one of mild curiosity. What sort of concerns, Ambassador? HFY consulted his notes with the air of a professor about to deliver a lecture on why water was wet. Our preliminary assessments suggest that humans may be unsuited for the rigorous demands of interstellar trade relationships. Your species appears to have evolved under unusually gentle conditions, resulting in certain physical limitations that could prove problematic in more challenging environments. The silence that followed was the kind that typically preceded either violent explosions or very bad decisions. Quinn's smile never wavered, but something shifted in her posture, a subtle adjustment that somehow made her appear less like a harmless diplomat and more like a coiled spring waiting for an excuse to demonstrate basic physics principles. Physical limitations, she repeated, her tone remaining perfectly pleasant. Could you be more specific? This was the moment when a wiser individual might have recognized that they were standing on the edge of a very tall cliff, holding a very large rock, while gravity waited patiently to demonstrate why this combination rarely ended well. HFY, unfortunately, had never been accused of excessive wisdom. Please understand, we mean no offense, he continued, apparently unaware that the temperature in the room had somehow dropped several degrees. But your species lacks the natural armor plating that most civilized races possess. Your bone density appears insufficient for serious physical exertion, and your muscle development suggests an evolutionary history of minimal environmental challenges. War champion Thokma, who had been standing silently behind HFY's chair like a 7-foot monument to the concept of intimidation, chose this moment to contribute his own observations to the conversation. His voice carried the kind of deep rumble typically associated with tectonic shifts or very angry weather patterns. What the ambassador is attempting to communicate diplomatically, Thokma said, his chitinous face plates clicking together in what passed for a condescending smile, is that your species appears to be composed of the galactic equivalent of soap bubbles. We are concerned that normal interaction protocols might result in accidental injury or, more embarrassingly, accidental termination of your delegation. The human delegation sat in silence for several seconds, processing this information with the kind of thoughtful consideration typically reserved for complex mathematical equations or wine selections. Quinn's expression shifted through several barely perceptible changes before settling on something that could generously be called professionally amused. I see, she said finally. So you're suggesting that humans are too fragile to engage in standard galactic commerce because we lack natural armor and appear physically weak by your standards. Precisely, HFY confirmed, apparently mistaking her tone for acceptance of his assessment. We would, of course, be willing to establish modified protocols that account for your species' limitations. Perhaps trade conducted entirely through remote communications or supervised interactions with appropriate safety measures in place. Quinn stood up from her chair with a kind of fluid motion that somehow managed to be both graceful and slightly unsettling. She removed her diplomatic jacket and laid it carefully across the back of her chair, revealing arms that, while not particularly large by Zephyrian standards, possessed a certain wiry definition that suggested regular use. That's very considerate of you, she said, rolling up her sleeves with the methodical precision of someone preparing for manual labor. However, I think there might be a small misunderstanding regarding human physical capabilities. Would you be interested in a practical demonstration? Thokmar's laugh was the sort of sound that avalanches probably made when they were feeling particularly jovial. A demonstration? Little human, I appreciate your spirit, but surely you don't intend to suggest that your soft-skinned species could match Zephyrian strength. Not match, Quinn corrected, her smile taking on a quality that should have made every alarm bell in the facility start ringing urgent warnings. Just clarify some misconceptions about human limitations. The war champion's bioarmor plates flared slightly, a reflexive display that indicated either amusement or the beginning stages of aggression. In Thokmar's case, the distinction was largely academic since both emotions typically resulted in something getting broken. Very well, he rumbled, straightening to his full intimidating height. What sort of demonstration did you have in mind? Perhaps you would like to arm wrestle? Or maybe lift some of our standard equipment to show your strength? Quinn shook her head, her expression taking on the kind of patient amusement typically displayed by teachers explaining basic concepts to particularly slow students. Nothing so complicated. Just a simple test of impact force. You hit me, then I hit you. We'll see who hits harder. The silence that followed was the kind that typically occurred right before natural disasters or major historical events. Thokmar's facial plates shifted through several configurations as he processed this suggestion, apparently trying to determine whether he'd misheard something or if the fragile little human had just proposed mutual violence as a diplomatic solution. You want me to hit you? He asked, his tone suggesting that he was having difficulty with the basic concept. Nothing too dramatic, Quinn assured him, stretching her arms with the casual ease of someone warming up for a pleasant afternoon jog. Just enough to demonstrate your superior Zephyrian strength. Then I'll return the favor so you can see what human strength looks like. Kethvar leaned forward in his chair, his expression cycling through confusion, concern, and the kind of fascinated horror typically reserved for watching traffic accidents in slow motion. Miss Reeves, I must strongly advise against this course of action. War Champion Thokmar is one of our most accomplished warriors. His strength could easily prove fatal to someone of your delicate constitution. I appreciate the concern, Quinn replied, bouncing lightly on her toes in a way that suggested she was actually looking forward to this exchange. But I think you'll find human durability has been significantly underestimated in your assessment reports. What followed was the kind of moment that historians would later describe as the point where everything went spectacularly wrong for the Zephyrian understanding of human biology. Thokmar, after several more attempts to talk the apparently suicidal human out of her proposal, finally accepted that she was serious about this deeply inadvisable course of action. He drew back his massive arm, muscles bunching beneath his bioarmor like geological formations preparing for an earthquake. The other Zephyrians in the chamber unconsciously stepped back, recognizing the preparation for what their culture considered a moderately powerful strike, enough to demonstrate superiority without immediately pulverizing the fragile alien into a fine paste. Thokmar's fist connected with Quinn's shoulder with a sound like a hammer striking leather. The impact would have been sufficient to send most civilized species flying across the room in several distinct pieces. Quinn absorbed the blow with a slight grunt and a small step backward to maintain her balance. Then she looked up at the towering war champion and smiled the kind of smile that made nearby gravity fields nervous about their job security. Nice technique, she commented, rolling her shoulder experimentally. Your turn to see what a human punch feels like. The next few seconds unfolded with the kind of dreamlike inevitability that typically characterized major natural disasters or significant reductions in local property values. Quinn stepped forward, drew back her considerably smaller fist, and delivered what appeared to be a casual, almost lazy punch to Thokmar's center mass. The war champion's 7-foot frame lifted off the ground and traveled backward through the air with the approximate velocity and trajectory of a trebuchet projectile. He impacted the reinforced wall of the conference chamber with enough force to embed himself roughly 6 inches into the crystalline composite material, where he remained for several seconds making small groaning sounds that suggested his worldview was undergoing rapid and unwelcome revisions. The silence that followed was the kind that typically occurred after significant explosions, or when someone realized they'd accidentally started an interstellar war. Every Zephyrian in the chamber stared at the Quinn-shaped hole in their understanding of basic physics, while Quinn herself calmly retrieved her jacket and began putting it back on. I think there may have been some errors in your initial assessment, she mentioned conversationally, smoothing down her sleeves with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone who regularly punched massive alien warriors through walls as part of their daily routine. Humans aren't fragile. We just don't see the need to wear our skeletons on the outside. Kethva's mandibles moved soundlessly for several seconds, producing the kind of expression typically seen on individuals who had recently discovered that everything they thought they knew about reality had been thoroughly and publicly disproven. But your bone density readings, your muscle development, the lack of natural armor. Quinn's smile took on the patient quality of someone explaining basic facts to a confused child. Ambassador, humans evolved on a planet with roughly twice the gravity of your homeworld. What you interpret as delicate bone structure is actually incredibly dense calcium phosphate composite that developed under crushing gravitational stress. What looks like insufficient muscle development is actually optimized muscle fiber that can generate tremendous force in compact packages. She gestured casually toward Thokma, who was still making small whimpering sounds from his wall-embedded position. Your people developed impressive external armor because you needed protection from your environment. Humans developed internal structure that can withstand tremendous stress because our environment was actively trying to crush us flat every second of every day. The war champion finally extracted himself from the wall with a series of cracking sounds that suggested his bio-armor would require significant maintenance before it could be considered structurally sound again. He swayed slightly on his feet, his facial plates configured in an expression of profound philosophical confusion. The soft skin. He mumbled, apparently still trying to reconcile his fundamental understanding of the universe with recent evidence to the contrary. Flexible skin, Quinn corrected gently. It allows for better heat distribution and doesn't crack under stress the way rigid armor plating does. Much more practical for species that needed to adapt quickly to changing conditions. Vexthor, who had been standing motionless since Quinn's demonstration began, finally found his voice. But the reports, the classifications, everything indicated that humans were among the most fragile species in known space. Quinn shrugged, the gesture somehow managing to convey both sympathy and mild amusement. Your evaluation methods were probably based on surface observations and comparisons to species from lower gravity worlds. It's an understandable mistake. Most civilized planets don't produce evolutionary pressure that results in compact biological weapon systems disguised as diplomatic personnel. The implications of this statement settled over the assembled Zephyrians like a particularly unwelcome blanket made of existential dread and revised threat assessments. If humans were this much stronger than their preliminary evaluation suggested, and if they'd been classified as the weakest species in known space, then the entire galactic power structure might need some rather significant recalculation. Kethva slowly reached for his communication console with the careful movements of someone who suspected that sudden gestures might provoke additional demonstrations of human physics. I believe, he said carefully, that we may need to revisit some of our assumptions about human capabilities. That would probably be wise, Quinn agreed, settling back into her chair with the same casual ease she'd displayed throughout the encounter. Now, shall we discuss those trade agreements? I think you'll find that humans are very interested in establishing mutually beneficial relationships with species that treat us as equals rather than fragile curiosities. The remainder of the negotiations proceeded with a level of Zephyrian courtesy and respect that was quite remarkable, considering that most of it was motivated by the newly discovered knowledge that their fragile guests could apparently punch through reinforced walls without breaking stride. Trade concessions that had been considered non-negotiable suddenly became surprisingly flexible, and several restrictive clauses regarding human physical limitations were quietly removed from the proposed agreements. As the human delegation prepared to depart several days later, Kethva found himself reviewing the hastily revised assessment reports that his staff had compiled. The new classification was considerably more accurate, if somewhat alarming in its implications. Species designation, humans. Classification, Class A apex predators. Recommended handling, standard diplomatic protocols. Additional notes, previous assessment was catastrophically incorrect. Advise immediate revision of all interaction guidelines. Suggest treating human delegates with same level of caution typically reserved for armed Vorthak raiders or unstable antimatter containment systems. War Champion Thokma, still spotting several visible dents in his bioarmor, stood beside the ambassador's desk reviewing the updated files. His expression suggested someone who had recently experienced a profound spiritual awakening, possibly involving the realization that the universe was considerably more dangerous than he'd previously suspected. "I still can't quite believe it," he admitted, gingerly touching a particularly prominent dent near his left shoulder plate. "They look so harmless." "That," Kethvar observed with the tone of someone who had learned important lessons about making assumptions, "appears to be the point. A species that can generate that much destructive force while appearing completely non-threatening would have significant advantages in both predation and defense." The ambassador paused in his review of the revised reports, struck by a sudden and deeply unsettling thought. "Vexthor, bring up the files on human homeworld environmental conditions." His aide complied, projecting the relevant data onto the conference room's main display screen. The information that appeared was the kind that made experienced military strategists wake up in cold sweats and reconsider their career choices. Gravity, 1.87 standard galactic units. Atmospheric pressure, 2.3 standard. Average temperature variance, extreme. Seasonal weather patterns, catastrophic. Dominant life forms, universally hostile. Geological stability, questionable. Overall habitability rating. How are these people still alive? "D. Cosmic forces," Kethvar whispered, his voice carrying the kind of are typically reserved for natural disasters or religious experiences. "They evolved on a death world. A legitimate, certified, absolutely terrifying death world." Thokmar leaned closer to the display, his facial plates shifting into an expression of dawning horror. "Look at the predator listings. Everything on their planet is trying to kill everything else, and the humans somehow became the dominant species." "Not just dominant," Kethvar corrected, scrolling through additional environmental data with the fascinated revulsion of someone watching a particularly gruesome accident. According to this, they actively eliminated most of their major predatory competitors and then developed agriculture, civilization, and interstellar travel while living on a planet that appears to be actively hostile to biological existence. The two Zephyrians stared at the data in silence for several minutes, processing the implications of their recent diplomatic encounter. Somewhere in the distance, they could hear the sounds of maintenance crews repairing the wall that Quinn had used to demonstrate human Zephyrian strength differentials. "Perhaps," Thokmar suggested finally, "we should send a message to the Territorial Council recommending that humans be moved to the preferred trading partners list." "Already done," Kethvar confirmed, his tone suggesting someone who had learned valuable lessons about the importance of maintaining positive relationships with species capable of casual wall destruction. "I also took the liberty of recommending immediate diplomatic exchanges with their government. If we're going to share a galaxy with apex predators disguised as harmless diplomats, I'd prefer to have them as allies rather than enemies." The revised assessment reports were filed, the trade agreements were ratified, and the Zephyrian understanding of galactic power dynamics underwent the kind of comprehensive renovation typically associated with major geological events. Throughout known space, species that had previously dismissed humans as harmless curiosities began quietly upgrading their threat assessments and reconsidering the wisdom of casual hostility toward Earth's representatives. And in a small office aboard the departing human vessel, Quinn Reeves finished her own diplomatic report with a satisfied smile. The negotiations had gone exactly as planned, the trade agreements were favorable to human interests, and the Zephyrians had learned some valuable lessons about the dangers of judging species by their exterior packaging. She sealed the report and forwarded it to Colonial Authority headquarters with a brief note: "Initial contact successful. Recommend standard diplomatic protocols for future Zephyrian interactions. Minor cultural misunderstanding regarding human physical capabilities has been resolved through practical demonstration." The universe, as always, continued its ancient practice of teaching important lessons to those arrogant enough to believe they understood how things worked. And somewhere in the vast bureaucratic machinery of galactic civilization, file clerks began the tedious process of updating their threat assessment databases to reflect the recent discovery that appearances could be not only deceiving, but occasionally catastrophically so. The moral of the story, had anyone been keeping track of such things, was relatively straightforward. Never assume that evolution's most dangerous predators would be polite enough to look the part. Sometimes the deadliest creatures in the galaxy wore diplomatic uniforms, smiled pleasantly, and only revealed their true nature when someone was foolish enough to suggest they needed protection from the rough realities of interstellar politics. It was, all things considered, a lesson worth learning, even if the tuition had involved some rather expensive war repairs.